We're here in Cleveland, Ohio, in Settlers Park. Settlers Park is dedicated to the founding of the city of Cleveland in 1796. General Moses Cleveland was paid by the Connecticut Land Company to come and survey this part of the country. Now, you may have heard of the term Case Western Reserve, but let me tell you where it's from. This part of Ohio, which wasn't really Ohio at the time, was the Western Reserve of Connecticut. Now, think about where Connecticut is, and all of this land west of Connecticut, it was their Western Reserve. They hadn't figured out what to do with it. Basically, it belonged to them. Moses Cleveland came to these shores right here on the bank of the Cuyahoga River, and he surveyed this land, and eventually it became the city of Cleveland, Ohio. And that's an interesting lesson, but that's not why we're here. I'm here to tell you a story about a man named George Peake. George Peake is the first African-American settler in Cleveland, Ohio. He was born in 1722. He died in 1827. He has a remarkable story. Now, in that period of time, remember this is before the Revolutionary War, he lived in what would be known as British America. Because remember, the colonies were owned by the United Kingdom, by the king. They were in a war called the French Indian War. Some people refer to it as the 7 Years' War, where they were trying to annex Canada, because Canada wasn't under the throne at the time. And so it wasn't uncommon for settlers, for those who lived in the colonies, to raise their hand and volunteer to join the British Army in service to King George. George Peake was one of those people. George Peake was a free-born black man. He was born in Maryland, and then his family moved to Pennsylvania. He raised his hand to be a part of the British Army, and he served under a man named General James Wolfe. Now, he served in one of the most decisive battles of the French Indian War, which was the Battle of Quebec. And the Battle of Quebec kind of solidified the British stronghold on the territory, and it turned the tide eventually in the British favor. They eventually won that battle. They annexed Quebec and then Montreal, which would have been to the west of it. And George Peake served in that battle. Somewhere along the line, some charges were brought forward that George had stolen money that was meant to pay the soldiers. So we have to ask our question at this charge. We have to ask ourselves two questions, basically. How and why? So blacks were serving in the British Army, but they weren't treated very well. And there is documentation that supports this. And that's not a big shocker. I mean, this was in the 1700s. It's 2022, and we still see instances around the world where blacks are not treated well, where blacks are not treated fairly. So the why George Peake may have deserted could be answered with the reality that he just wasn't being treated very well. And that's not a bridge too far. But the how is another question. Because how would he become in charge of, how would he have access to the pay for soldiers? Well, there is a term, it's an offensive term. I'm going to use it just for the sake of our examining the subject matter. The term is mulatto. George Peake was a mulatto. That's another word for someone who is of mixed race. Now, the word either comes from the Latin, which is mulus, which means mule. The English word mule comes from the Latin word mulus, which is an adaptation, a hybrid of a horse and a donkey. Or from the Arab word muwalad, which is defined by a person who is brought up in an Arab community and with all the Arab traditions, but does not have Arab blood. Or maybe it's a mix of both. But suffice it to say that George was in charge of or had access to some of the pay for soldiers. Now, this allegation, we're never seeing any documentation of charges or anything that was brought forth, but it's said that that's where he got his initial wealth. Now, you could say that perhaps because of his race, he may have been trusted a little more. I'm pretty certain that he was not in charge of any white soldiers' pay, probably just the pay of black soldiers. Now, in Drake's Voyages, a publication from the 1600s, we see that white and black were looked at as separate species. So you can see science has come a long way. And then those of a mixed race were seen as being of a different species altogether. So a third species, right? And we know that none of that's true. But again, this was in the 1600s. But United States, America, did racism on a scale beyond what any other nation or country had done it. There's this thing called Peritus Sequentur Vernum. Peritus Sequentur Ventrum. I'm sorry. It's Latin, and it simply means that which is from the womb follows the womb. America did racism unlike any other country or community or continent. America took this, what was the accepted practice of the day, where a child, the offspring of a parent, in this case the father, took the status of the father. America reversed that and turned it on its ear. And here's why. It was well known as British common law that the child carries the status of the father. That was like all over the world. But in order to continue to subjugate its black and brown persons, remember, this was before the Revolutionary War, so slavery hadn't become what it would become in America, but we were already putting into place these societal norms where if you were born and your mom was enslaved, then you would be enslaved. And you'll notice, I try not to use the term slave because slave is a state of mind, and I don't believe we were ever slaves, but we were enslaved. You'd have to have given up on all hope of freedom, which we never did. So with this Peritus Sequentur Ventrum, what America did was it ensured that offspring of a woman who was enslaved would also be enslaved. And so if you were of mixed race, because America started this black-white thing. Again, America did racism like no other country in the world. If in the 1800s you bumped into somebody in the street and you asked them their race, they would never say white. They would say Irish, German, Polish, Slovenian. That was their race. America turned black and white into this good and not good thing. It's a myth, but that's what they did. And so then, if you were white, you were good. If you were black, then you could be treated any kind of way. That's what America did. Black and white racism started in America. Remember, you go over to Europe, everybody's Caucasian. So you can't say white, black. It was where you were from. It was your true identity. That's what America did with black and white. So suffice it to say that George Peake is charged with absconding the pay of soldiers. He did desert from the army. There's not a lot of information about that. Again, the war was over after he served. The Battle of Quebec was won, and then England was able to annex Canada, and that's why Canada is under the crown as even today. So he served in that army. He served in that war, and if the allegations are true, he at some point left. Now Canada's not too far from Cleveland, and he ends up back in this part of the country in America. If he did it with the money that he absconded. So George, with his family now, his wife Hannah, he had 4 sons: James, Henry, George Jr., and Joseph. They settled in what we now know today as Rocky River. He bought 100 acres of land with the money that he had. His wife was also well off, And the story is that they were well received by their community. Now, I don't know if it was because of his mixed race status, although we could probably infer that that might have been part of it. But George was also an inventor. George invented a hand corn mill, which was superior to the way that they ground corn back in the day. What they did was they took corn, they dried it out, they put it in a mortar and pestle, and then they pounded it to make cornmeal, which was, first of all, hard work, and then not that efficient. He devised a hand cornmeal with stones that would grind the corn up very fine, and he made a lot of money from it. So the family was able to increase their wealth in that regard too. And I think that also endeared him and his family to the community where they lived. In that time, believe it or not, in Cleveland, whites and blacks lived together. There was no white part of the settlement, black part. Whites and blacks lived together. And there's many scholars that document that. So he was well received as part of his community. He lived to be 105 years old, and he parceled off his land, the 100 acres that he bought. He parceled off his land to his sons. I've been to the property where Joseph lived and made a homestead. We don't know where the other ones are, and we also don't know where George is buried, so that remains unknown. But George Peake, the first settler to Cleveland, Ohio, the first black African-American settler to Cleveland, Ohio. This is his story, and we hope that going forward we'll find more information about him. But I want you to know, as part of this first African-American series of Cleveland, Ohio, the first African-American citizen to settle here in this part of Ohio, in Cleveland, his name is George Peake, and this is his story. So, like we always say, you can find Black history anywhere, because Black history is everywhere. Truth be told, we want you to know what it is. We want you to be excited about it. We want you to maybe roll up your sleeves and find out more than perhaps we have even discovered. This series is ongoing, and so we're going to be bringing you more of it as time goes on. So thanks for joining us. Hope we can see you again real soon.
If you would like to see more videos like this, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification icon to receive our new releases. If you would like to assist Truth Be Told in our mission to preserve African American history, which is American history, please share this video with your children, family, and friends. Truth Be Told, you can find Black history anywhere because our history is everywhere.